Thank you, Arvind. I'm breathless, as I think a lot of the audience is as well. I'm not going to have the chairman's privilege of asking the first question because I know that there are a whole host of people here who I know want to do that. Before I do that, I want to recognize the Finance Minister, Shri Jaitley, who has very much wanted to be in the audience and listen. Welcome, sir. The way you've posed the questions then in itself has sparked lots of thoughts. Can the world afford to absorb another China? And the West versus the rest. And I think there are lots of ideas here that you've put forward, but what's really most heartening is that you've actually laid out a strategy for dealing with Brexit, with dealing with what's happening in the United States, and that I think opens up a whole avenue of discussion. So let me throw the floor open and have a show of hands. Happy to first recognize Professor Govinda Rao. We have microphones, I think, because everything is being live on the web. I should mention that we are live on the web. This is being web streamed live, so please be conscious of that. Govinda Rao.
That was a very fascinating talk, very, very realistic, and a talk which will actually lead to very useful policy interventions in the future. I have a small observation and a question. The observation is that your conclusion that the strong form of globalization will, there will be difficulties, and of course there will be shallow forms of globalization that will exist. But I mean, if you look at the European Union, there has been a huge problem there to begin with. One is they have a birth defect, in the European Union proper, in the sense that they are a monetary union but not a fiscal union, I mean, excluding the UK. And in that sense, UK never got fully assimilated into the system. That's one of the problems that we have. So the model that we are talking about, has many more difficulties and problems, inherent problems within it. So from there, to what extent we can go further on that is one of the issues. The second, the point that observation that I'm going to make is, in this stronger form of, strong form of globalization that is dead, the shallow form will continue. One of the major things, even from looking at the lessons of European Union, is the mobility of labor. In fact, that is going to be a crucial issue as we go further. And there has not been much of a problem with regard to the capital mobility and various other things, but then labor mobility has been, particularly the unskilled labor mobility has been a major issue. How do you react to that?
Okay, do you want to take a few questions together? Yeah. So I have a whole host of hands. I'm going to request everybody to be very short and be very succinct. Govinda, we'll just take a lot of questions together. Vijay Joshi? A little closer to the microphone, please.
You envisage India occupying the space that China vacates, but that would imply India being willing to take on or willing to be part or able to be part of what is called the international fragmentation of production. I mean, China is a very big player in that space, if you want to call it that. Is India, I mean, is India at the moment able to do that? It's certainly not done it in the past. And B, what would you suggest should be, I mean, if India is to play such a part, what are the policies? Second question, you raised a lot of questions about regional trade agreements. I wasn't entirely sure what your take on, I mean, what should India be doing right now vis-a-vis the RCEP, and there is a school of thought actually expounded at great length by your ex-colleague Bergston in the Institute for International. It says that India should try very hard to be part of TPP, etc., and what comes out of it. So what do you think about that?
Pranab Bardhan at the back. Please give him a microphone.
I think I largely agree with your assessment of what's happening in the West. My question is really about how should India react? And there, I'm torn myself, but I noticed that you are essentially going toward the outward orientation. But I notice you are pessimistic about outward orientation in manufacturing. So if I understood you correctly, you want outward expansion more in the services, international trade. There, could you be a little more specific, particularly given the big job problem that we have? Are you thinking of not the software and skill-intensive services, but the more labor-intensive services? And if so, then what kind of service sector is prospects in outward orientation you have in mind? Thank you.
T.N. Nainan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, two quick questions. You mentioned shallow globalization and you mentioned flows of capital and trade likely to continue. So the first question is, when something like 1/3 of world debt capital is now earning less than real interest rates, less than less than zero, don't you see that as a threat to global capital itself and what might happen to the global financial system as a consequence? And the second is that global trade, I think, for the last couple of years has been growing slower than global GDP. So the assumption that trade will continue to be part of shallow globalization, and the WTO is increasingly listing more and more anti-trade protectionist measures by country after country. So there seems to be even shallow globalization going into reverse gear.
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for these excellent questions. Let me take them in reverse order because I think they get progressively more complicated politically to answer. But let me, on the last point, it is true, and I forgot to mention that in the period 2013, 14, 15, world trade to GDP had either declined or flattened out, even before anything happened. And the World Bank did some research on that, showing that part of the reason was that actually the value-added chain phenomenon was actually receding because China was actually moving out from that. Now, my own view is that, as I said, if policy doesn't react adversely, the technology driver, of forms we can't even anticipate going forward, will be something going forward which should offset anything going. So I think shallow integration, broadly current levels of trade. I just want to mention one analytical point that in some ways, if you think about where we are on trade globalization and where we might be in a kind of ideal world, we're about 25 to 30% of our way to the final destination. So in that sense, we've by no means exhausted technologically the possibilities. Of course, politics and policy can interfere. So I think a trade to GDP ratio not declining rapidly is an assumption that broadly I could be comfortable with. Also because, as I said, the whole crisscrossing thing, it will put some checks on very bad behavior on this. Now, on the whole negative, zero and negative interest rate phenomenon, I mean, essentially, I think it's created lots of problems, right? It's created limits in terms of how we can respond on monetary policy. Having done that, the potential for financial instability going forward. But I think the point that you make, and this is the figure that's been quoted, is that something like $16 trillion of thing is now facing zero or negative interest rates. So what does that mean? I think what it means is that it does store up a lot of potential instability going forward. Just to give you one manifestation of that, low interest rates. See, when Brexit happened, I don't know how many of you noticed that when Brexit happened, stocks of MetLife and other financials collapsed. The reason being that low interest rates basically dramatically increases the liability obligations on pension funds and so on. So essentially it's increasing the unfunded liabilities going forward, and of course that creates a whole lot of complications. So there's no question that but then we are struggling with this constant thing between the short run and the long run. In the short run, you want to inject more and more juice because of whatever secular stagnation, declining productivity, but we know that every time you do that, you're actually only postponing the long-term problem. In a sense, China is facing the same by taking on more debt. Advanced countries are doing the same by following QE and extraordinarily low policy. I think that, to me, the real challenge has been, the problem has been that we've tried to respond to the global financial crisis and its aftermath with basically one instrument. Fiscal policy was taken out of the equation in all across the world, and it is no wonder that so instead of taking aggressive fiscal policy action to avert the slowdown, you're doing all this contortions on the monetary side, which is just postponing the fiscal day of reckoning. So that's how I see the kind of financial system. Now, on Pranab's point about, let me be clear. I absolutely think that Make in India and manufacturing are very important. However, I think that India is in a kind of privileged situation that we do not have to rely just on manufacturing. We are and have been a services powerhouse, and now if we can also reverse, remember, we underwent premature deindustrialization for the last 40 years or 30 years, and Make in India is trying to reverse that. So I think that we should, to use Mao's famous words, we should walk on two legs. We should do both manufacturing and services because we have the capability to do so. It's possible that because of our inherited handicaps in manufacturing, over all those policies that all of you have so well documented, it may be a little bit more difficult to, achieve what the East Asian countries did 34, 40 years ago. Because not only is that the legacy handicap that we also have the fact that technology is changing in a way that even regular manufacturing is going to become less employment intensive. So I think that's why I think the world is going to be a bit different. We are handicapped, and there's no reason why we should just rely on manufacturing, and I think we should do both. Now, just to give you one example, I think, I think Nainan wrote about this, and some others, and Sunil Jain, for example. I think the clothing initiative that the government undertook, a month ago, is an example of saying that, we've not given up on manufacturing. It does continue to be a viable option, and similar such initiatives are being contemplated in other labor-intensive manufacturing sectors as well. So I think we have, the handicap, the changing world, but we have the ability to walk on two legs, and I think that's what we should do going forward. Vijay, your point about, vacating, the vacated space to occupy that, India needs to do a lot. And I think there's no doubt about that. I think there's a whole bunch of things that the government has embarked upon, whether it's ease of doing business, FDI, infrastructure, public investment, regional experiments in labor and land reform. I just think that we have to do everything, everywhere, today. And the pace at which we're headed in the right direction, the pace at which it can move will, of course, be dictated by political constraints and the overall environment. So I think that what we need to do is clear. I think we need to do a lot of things. Nobody is saying that China's vacated space will be automatically occupied by India. The hard work is cut out for us. On international integration, I do think that we do need to integrate more and more. I've said that. I think we need to engage in ways that recognize and is cognizant of the changing world reality. I think whether we should do UK, EU, RCEP, is a matter of tactics. It's not a matter of principle. I think already, I think the Commerce Minister, as I said, has spoken about the UK. I mean, I think we should move forward with the UK and EU as well. And of course, on RCEP, we are engaged in these negotiations fully. And I think we should, again, move on all legs going forward. I mean, the birth defect point is well taken. I think people recognize that. But I think that what I'm saying is that it's going to be much more difficult to remedy those and move to deeper integration. It's much more likely that we're going to have. And of course, and the point about the mobility of labor is absolutely well taken. But labor mobility is, I think, deep integration. And I do think that that's why that's more difficult to do that.
I have lots of hands. Swami?
Yes, Arvind, you pointed out that both in theory and in experience, rapid growth is not possible unless you have substantial growth of exports. But we have the situation right now in India, where our exports have been falling for 17 months in a row. Our export to GDP ratio is going down, and yet we are supposed to have become the fastest growing country in the world. Viewed in this, three possibilities. First, our data are wrong. We are not really growing so fast at all. Second possibility, we are growing fast, but it's about to collapse because it's unviable and cannot continue. And third, we've done something miraculous that has completely changed the paradigm. Which of those three would you opt for?
In this case, I can handle Swami. So,
do you want to wait, or do you
no,
want
no,
I want to
Swami
handle
Swami deserves a rapid fire response. No, first point, Swami, is that, this is something that I have looked into quite deeply, and the IMF has helped us with some data. If you look at export volume growth, non-oil export volume growth in the last 2 years, India is by no means, it's somewhere in the middle or above median in terms of performance. So the declining export story, manufacturing, non-oil exports, because we don't want to take oil in. No, India is by no means an outlier. And what that means is that the declining exports is, predominantly or overwhelmingly due to the fact that, world demand has slowed down, and not because, given world demand, we've lost competitiveness. So that's not the story on the exports. So in that sense, and then how can you have reasonably rapid growth with declining exports? I think the answer is that consumption engine has been firing, and the public investment engine has been firing. So I think these two make up for the decline in exports. So that's how we're generating the growth that we have.
Robert Lawrence?
Arvind,
It's on.
Arvind, I think you've given us a brilliant analysis, and I agree with your policy prescriptions, given your assumptions. But you said
sorry,
something.
Robert, once again, I was remiss in saying that the phrase and the concept of deep integration is due to Robert Lawrence, actually.
Well, my question won't be that deep. You said that the TPP would be the test case. I'd like to offer a somewhat different statement as to what will be the test case, and that will be the US elections will be the test case. Because I noticed you gave us an analysis. I think you didn't mention the name Trump. and I think that who is elected is more likely to be the most powerful determinant of the world in which we will be living next year. I think if we get Hillary Clinton, even if we haven't yet got the TPP, there's a great likelihood she will go back to the negotiating table and try to put something together that will resemble the TPP. And so I think your analysis would hold. I think if Mr. Trump is elected and we can trust half of what he says he's trying to do, he will actually, he has the capacity, by the way, unfortunately, as an American president, to unilaterally, without the Congress, have the United States withdraw from all its international agreements within 6 months. So that under those circumstances, think about the global trading system, think about the global system as a whole. Under those circumstances, I ask you, would you give the same advice to India? Second part of my question, think about an analysis of what could happen in Europe. Europe at the moment may well succeed in holding together. But you pointed out the need for the hegemon, and in fact it's quite possible that what we see is disintegration of the United Kingdom, and indeed several countries leaving Europe, thereby depressing global growth. So I'd like you to think about the pessimistic scenario and how you would then advocate India would respond.
I think on the first one, I think please invite me back to the IPF next year, and I think that would be the time to answer that, because I think that's a hypothetical. Because my prognosis is, I stand by shallow integration continuing. The personalities involved. We'll see. Let's see what happens. I think that. But that is also my response to your second question. I think that, even in the most dire disintegration scenario, I still think, the shallow forms persist. Nobody is saying in Europe that goods or services or capital should not move freely within, and even on labor, I think it's a question of, how much not the principle of labor mobility. So, the dire Eurozone thing also goes back to no currency union, but not necessarily autarky and trade barriers and complete fragmentation. So but that's a call I'm making based on this. I may be proved wrong, but let's see what happens in a few months' time.
Okay, I'm going to take a few questions together. Anupam Khanna, and then I'm going to ask T.N. Srinivasan. So in that order, please.
Yeah, as expected, extremely lucid, very rich presentation, but that obviously calls for a lot of questions we don't have time for. Your topic was very much Brexit and US elections, and you're focused very much on a bilateral or bipolar world, the West being one and India, implications for India. But do you think, my question is, the analytics change, especially in the light of that the world is at least tripolar, in a simplest form? Whether you look at energy, which is a major determining factor for our future, finance or trade, if the world, energy prices are not driven by what consumption happens in the West anymore. It's China which has been doing that. So do the analytics change? Specifically then, I think people have already said that the idea of space being vacated by China, that's a misplaced question because we are not able. But you answered saying we are a services powerhouse. That is absolutely not true. We are a very narrow, the only sector which is actually the numbers are have moved in the right direction is IT. Everywhere else, the numbers show that we have actually been moving in the wrong direction in services. Sorry? No, that's not services. That's products. So the question just a question on that is, if it is that narrow, going forward, the technology, the other leg of your argument is on technology, and the technological development in the case of the types of services that you're talking of are moving in the wrong direction as far as we are concerned. So the question that I have is, unless you put your strategy in this tripolar context, I don't think it actually adds up.
Okay. You take T.N.?
Yeah, T.N.
Professor Srinivasan.
I'm very glad you have moved to the supporting outward orientation at last. Yeah, your previous
the prodigal son returns, T.N.
Previous commitment to outward orientation was always followed by, but India, this, that, and the other mindset has not changed. This other things have not happened, and so it's premature for India to move to embrace outward orientation. On that ground, I am very glad you have at last seen the light. Now, on the this China question, this is to pursue what Bob Lawrence was asking you. Now, take the change in the goods trade, the 0.5% to China 6%, which is the numbers which you put in, excluding services, world trade share. Now, this happened. Remember, India moved from 0.3% to 0.5, little less than 0.3% to 0.5%, while China tripled or quadrupled the trade share. And now in a global context where the global growth is going to be slower, now you are projecting that India will be able to gain shares relative to China. And I don't quite see. You do say that this is going to be in the services sector. There again, the difference is smaller, but the problem is similar with respect to China. So I'm not quite sure whether this you are waving your hands or whether you have a really serious model that you have worked on which suggests that this is a feasible proposition for India.
Suman Perry?
Let me just repeat what others have said about a brilliant exposition. One kind of broader point and then 2 points about Europe, if I may. The broader point is that more or less as a throwaway line, you came up with this 80-20 split between technology and globalization, and yet your talk is about a backlash against globalization. So, I mean, what accounts for that, as it were? Why is it that politicians in the West, as it were, have been willing to make globalization the whipping boy? Just an observation, because really what you're saying is that much of the distress in Europe and the United States is because of things that have relatively little to do with globalization, unless you feel the technological change and globalization are linked up. So that's just an analytic point. On Europe, 2 points. The first is you talk about the weakening of the West, and I don't have the numbers at hand, Arvind, but I think it's right to say that the relative share of global real output of the US hasn't changed all that much. What we've really seen is the rise of China and the eclipse of Europe. So, I mean, India has had a fairly good run of it, but I'm just wondering how much of the last 15 years is a one-off linked with China, and it is Europe that has actually borne the burden. And my second observation is really about Germany as hegemon, because let's remember that Britain as hegemon before Keynes, or in the period leading up to Keynes, had exactly this. It was running a massive trade surplus and exporting capital, which is the way in which it bound the peripheral countries to it. And that is what delivered the first phase of globalization. So why is it such an unsustainable model for Europe?
Easy answer to the last question is that imperialism. You know, you can no longer force your colonies to buy your products, and so we're in a kind of more democratic world where other countries do want to export and grow, and so I think I think the whole colonial thing is and the whole democratic difference is just too vast. I think. For the parallel, I think maybe I'm wrong to be right. On the other point, weakening West, I think that since 1990, just let me give you 2 pieces of statistics. One, US GDP growth has been slower than world GDP growth for the last 20 years or so. So US share is also declining in world GDP. But I think the other point is that it's not just the rise of China. If you see, I have a phrase called convergence with a vengeance. That is, in the last 20 to 25 years, and this is research I'm doing with my colleague Sutirtha here, is that if you see many more countries are growing more rapidly than the West and the United States, and at a much faster pace. So that by definition means that the share of world GDP, that not just one country, China, but a variety of countries are increasing their share of world GDP. So I think it's not just, of course, China is the most best example, but India, Chile, now many countries in Africa, so many of them have grown faster that I think, and the US has grown slower than the world. So I think broadly the weakening West, rising West is broader than I think what you're suggesting. On the 80-20 question, I mean, it's a little bit like, it's the kind of intellectual equivalent of looking for the lamp under the lamppost. We know nothing about technology, and that's why we focus on the 20% that's policy. So I think that's why. Remember that great Paul Krugman has that great story about how someone comes and says, I have this magic technology to convert, one set of goods into another, and then when it's posed as that, people say, yeah, fantastic. But then when you say that actually that technology is trade, people, kind of recoil and say it's something very different. So I think that technology is not the whipping boy because it's anonymous, disembodied. You don't know what its origins are. I think the fact about embodied globalization, I think, makes it, and the lamppost thing makes it. TN, on China versus India, let me say a few things. If you look at unit labor costs in China in manufacturing, they are rising rapidly. So, and combined with the fact that I think China is slowing down, I think China vacating space is and will happen. That is what convergence is going to deliver. Now, a recent IMF report was very interesting. If you look at China's share in all the major products, global share, it seems to be constant or declining slowly. But if you look at the same numbers from the reporting country point of view, which is the latest regional economic, it's declining dramatically. Shares in textiles, clothing, engineering, you look at it. So I think the China vacating space part, I think, is inevitable, happening, will accelerate. And rebalancing, I mean, to the extent that the Chinese officials are committed to that, will only accelerate that process. Yeah, but the flip side of will India occupy that? It's the second part of your question. We know what needs to be done, and the response. And I think that if we're able to do that, we occupy that space. And I think all the signs so far are that we will be able to do that. So let's wait and see in 10, 15 years whether we've occupied that vacated space or not. Now, I think on the analytics of the tripolar, in some space, this whole discussion about, my carbon analogy and the occupation of prior space, it is a tripolar thing. I mean, when I talk about China vacating space to allow the late convergers to come, implicit is I have a tripolar model of the world, and I have said in my in other writings that for China to be a kind of rising power and a kind of a wannabe hegemon, which I think it has aspirations to be, it has to take on the attributes of other hegemons, which is open market, steady currency, and emergency finance. I mean, the irony, of course, is that China has provided emergency and non-emergency finance across the board to a whole lot of countries in a way that the hegemon that prints the dollars has not been able to for and that's one of the ironies we can talk about. But in terms of providing markets, I think that's why Chinese rebalancing is critical for the late convergers like India to kind of occupy that space.
I have two more questions.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask Mr. Jaitley. You get to ask him questions since he's down the corridor from you. But if there's anything in public that you want him to say, this is your chance. Okay, Jen Krishna sitting here, and then we'll take Santosh Malhotra, and I think they'll wrap it up.
You did speak about...
Take a microphone, please.
You did speak about a proper balance between manufacturing and services-led growth. But should a country like, a populous country like India, beyond a point, focus on manufacturing at all? Because all future manufacturing investments are going to be technology-led. You'll have robotics, you'll have AI, you'll have 3D printing, and incremental jobs per 1,000 crore of investments will be few and far between.
So I think that two responses that there is no doubt that technology is happening, you know, robotics, all of that. One, I'm not an expert on this, but my sense is that, you know, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take some time. So I think that, you know, what we should see this as a narrow window of opportunity to exploit. And I think that's why the urgency of the clothing initiative, for example, is exactly aimed at that, you know, China is vacating space. There is this threat of technology. We have a 10, 15, 20-year window. So let's, really incentivize the clothing sector because it's, provides employment, provides female employment, provides jobs, and so on. So I think, as we go along, we have to confront this whole technology thing. But let's not, I think, over-dramatize and kind of make it seem as if it's going to happen tomorrow when maybe it's going to take a bit of time and give us some window of opportunity.
Santosh, last question.
In the last 25 years, manufacturing share in GDP has remained the same. Manufacturing share in employment has remained roughly the same. So you'll forgive me if I have a certain degree of skepticism like Vijay Joshi and Pranab Bardhan about what we are able to do. Yet you say that we know what we need to do. It seems that certainly in the leather sector and the textiles garment sector we might be taking up a position. But do you believe that one of the policy or set of policy instruments relates to fixing the inverted duty structure? The inverted duty structure is certainly one of the reasons why there's been premature deindustrialization, which you have written about.
I think, on this I will defer to the finance minister, but I think consistently in the last two budgets, we have tried to identify inverted duty structures and correct them. I think that's been a consistent and conscious policy. It may not be done completely, maybe a work in progress, but that's, no better person than the finance minister to answer that. I've been part of some of these discussions, but the whole inverted duty structure problem has been a real, a conscious thing that the government has wanted to address in the last two budgets that I've been associated with. Please.
Absolutely, ma'am.
I'm a little bit worried and petrified about our increasing the defense budget. Now, if we increase our defense budget vis-a-vis what US wants us to do, would it not have an effect on our economy? Because I feel the FDI is coming in, and if we don't look at the micro level, our making India, manufacturing in India, all these industries are going to suffer. Our handloom industries are going to go because the land has to be acquired for the FDI institutions. I mean, where are we to go vis-a-vis, Mr. Subramanian, our micro industries? And if we increase our defense budget, we are gone.
I always say, defense budgets are just way above my pay grade. I know nothing about, and if I may crack a joke, it's nowadays also beyond my finance minister's pay grade.
All right. With that, I'm going to close this evening. First of all, let's just give a very loud and warm round of applause for Arvind Subramanian. I have a small favor to ask him to do. I need him to release the latest version of the India Policy Forum volume. I think for the photographers, we need to record this moment. This is the annual publication that prints the articles and the papers presented at last year's conference. There will be one next year as well. This is the proud outcome of all the work that goes into this conference. It is the highest ranked journal from India on citation counts, so I think we can all be proud of it. I want to thank particularly Karthik Muralidharan, who's here, Subir Gokran, who was the editor of this but now sits in Washington, And I want to welcome Barry Bosworth, who's going to again join the editorial team for next year. Thank you, Arvind, for releasing this. And I now want to welcome everybody to dinner outside and a drinks reception. Please join us for that. And thank you all for coming, and good evening.